There we go. The recording has started. So allow me to welcome to you today for this BAFA IPSIG annual webinar 2023. Associate Professor Martha O'Hagan. As mentioned earlier, she's an Associate Professor at Trinity Business School, Trinity College, Dublin. And her research spans across several different areas within finance. Just to name a few to you, she has focused her research on behavioural finance and also sustainable finance. She's published in several international renowned academic journals as well. But prior to academia, Martha worked in the banking industry in both London and Dublin. And during her academic career, not only was she busy doing her research over the years and completing a PhD a good few years ago, but she's also, it's pleasing to see that she's also been awarded several teaching awards. In fact, if I've got my facts correct, Martha will correct me if I'm wrong, Martha has been awarded a teaching award every year since 2018 up to 2023, which is astounding, which is fantastic to see. But without further ado, I don't want to be doing all the talking here. This is about Martha and Martha's work today. She's going to deliver a webinar lecture on an investigation into the financial incentives for afforestation in Ireland. So over to you, Martha.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation. And hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. I know there's a lot of demands on everybody's time. So thank you very much for turning up. And hopefully this will be in some way interesting, or will spark a discussion, interesting discussion. So just before I start, I suppose it's great to see that there is an interdisciplinary SIG, because actually I'll start to share the screen now. So I'll just bring this up. So can everybody see a slide that says forest? Okay. Or you can...
Yes, you can see that, Martha.
Perfect. Okay. So this is the first piece of interdisciplinary research that I've been involved in, and it is, I would say, by a country mile, the most interesting research that I've done. And just to explain how it came about, we had an external private donor to Trinity who specified that the money had to be used to fund research that was to do with sustainability, and it was interdisciplinary. And so this is work done with colleagues in botany, geography, computer science, and engineering. And it's made me realise how crucial interdisciplinary research is, because if we're to address our grand challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss, we need the scientists to tell us. So I would have been researching in sustainable finance prior to this, but we're only as good as we need ecologists to tell us what the right things to do are to protect nature. We need scientists to look at emissions and climate change, but they need the social scientists. We need policy, we need regulation, we need social norms to change. So I think it's crucial that we bring interdisciplinary researchers together. So I suppose this is one example of one such project, and I'm really happy to answer questions as to how it's working and how it's going. And overall, it's going great, and I'm learning lots about ecology that I never knew before, and I'm asking them lots of questions about everything and anything. And they ask me what's bond or equity. I'm like, that's far less interesting than knowing about native plants in Ireland, etc. Forest came about, I suppose, there's many natural habitats, many habitats where we look at biodiversity, but we have focused on forest in Ireland in particular. And it's a pretty interesting story, or I'm finding it really interesting. So Ireland as an island would have been forested about forest cover of about 80 to 85% hundreds of years ago, back to the 1600s. And then the process of deforestation began for the charcoal industry, for building, for making way for agriculture. But we got down as low as having forest cover of just 1% in 1925. And that was due to government policy. The policy was to use every scrap of available land for agriculture, for food production. And so every last tree that we could reach was removed. There's been a policy since kind of the 40s and 50s to a forest to bring that back up, and we're now at 11% forest cover, but that's the lowest in Europe. I think Malta might beat us, but we are apart from that, if not the lowest, the second lowest in forest cover. And just to put it into context, so we've 11% forest cover, and the EU average is 35%. So we are way behind the average. But what's more interesting when you take a deep dive into that, of that 11%, 9%, so 80% of the 11%, is in monospecies, non-native, such as Sitka spruce. So we're still, our forest cover in native woodland is still only 2%. And as I say, so Sitka spruce comes originally from I think it's Alaska, but the government policy for afforestation has been very focused on forestry as a source of timber. So just to, I suppose, talk about that there's a government target to increase. So it's recognised that our forest cover is extremely low and that we need to do something about it. And there's a forest target to have a cover by of 17% by 2030, still way behind the average, but bringing us up from 11%. And we've had targets initially of afforestation of 25,000 hectares, but actually that keeps getting reduced each year in terms of the target, because we're not meeting it. And we're this year, I think, even for 2023, so far less than 2,000 hectares have been planted. So clearly something's wrong. We have a government incentive scheme to meet this target. We need to do so for our EU climate targets, and we are falling far, far short of it. And in fact, even more alarmingly, when I spoke to Greenbelt, one of the forestry companies in Ireland, they said that a lot of the figures that look like afforestation are actually due to a replanting obligation. If you have a Sitka forest and you take it down, you have to replant. So it's even worse than it appears. So you can see in, oh, my cursor is not working. Oh, maybe I need to click in. There we go. So you can see in terms of afforestation that things have been getting worse, and landowners are not taking up these financial incentives. And there are incentives to plant both native trees, because it's recognised that we are very far behind in terms of native trees, but also there's still incentives to plant conifers for timber supply. But on both, we are falling well short. But something else to consider is there's alternative land uses. One is agriculture, but the others, how do we use our land to meet our climate targets? Should we also consider using land? Is it right to plant more trees, or should we also consider solar farms and wind farms as ways to meet our climate targets? So these are the kind of questions that arose and led us to look into this as a pretty interesting research project. So the forest project, as I say, it's joined with several different schools across the university, so it's all within Trinity, but across different disciplines. And its overall objective is to identify approaches to afforestation that are ecologically sound. So we need the botanists to tell us what we should be looking for. Societally just, so that's the geography department, are looking at the just transition and social, the local, there's been a lot of opposition to forestry in Ireland. I'll explain why. And also economically viable. So that's me in the business school. Finance is my background. So we're looking at the financial incentives of afforesting land in Ireland. So what's the sustainable financial model is one of the questions we would pose. Which trees and where? So again, if I haven't depressed you enough already about the state of forestry in Ireland, some of our forests were planted on peatland. And if you know much about peatland, I didn't know much, but they're a huge carbon sink when a peatland is functioning correctly. But if you plant trees on peatland, it dries out the peatland. The trees use up the water, and actually it emits carbon. So some of our existing forests, rather than being carbon sinks, are emitting carbon. So where you plant trees is crucial, and that's certainly something that Ireland has learned from past poor practices. So they were planted on woodland because that was seen as non-agricultural land and non-productive land. So that's why that land was used. But those trees have performed very badly. So actually, both ecologically, they aren't good, but they're actually the wood that has been produced is of poor quality. So there's a rethink on that one. What about technological solutions? There are being many solar farms are getting planning permission and being put in place in in Ireland. So that's one for our engineering school to look at. But also they're looking at the ecology aspect of technological solutions. So they're looking at biodiversity of solar farms and how can we take biodiversity into account to make sure that if we do use technological solutions, they have the least adverse effect on nature. What ecosystem services? So as I said, when the policy for afforestation was put in place in Ireland, it was really viewing forests or trees as a source of timber. And I think that's a cultural aspect. We are missing a forest culture, I would say, compared to many European countries who it's in their culture. They have foresters. They get that forestry is important for several different reasons. Whereas Ireland, I suppose, had lost its forest culture when it had gone down to 1% forest cover. And it really is, when you talk to people today, they still many people still really think of forests just as a source of timber. But timber, it's of course important, but it's just one ecosystem service that forests provide, and there's many benefits, and our financial incentives really incentivize still. If you were a rational, financially incentivized farmer, which of course farmers need to make a living, you would, regardless of the fact that we have targets for native forestry, there's still the design of our incentives really still point towards valuing just one ecosystem service, which is timber. And I'll come back to why in a minute. And can we measure and combine if we want to take different ecosystem services into account? So, the others are apart from timber are habitat for biodiversity. Trees, of course, can improve water and air quality. They have benefits for soil, and they have amenity value. So for things like mental health, and of course for carbon, they both sequester carbon and store carbon. So in line with our research aligns with many of the SDGs. So that's just to list those as well. So we had a stakeholder forum just over a year ago where we met with foresters in Ireland. We met with people from business. We met with investors looking to invest in forestry. We had policy with people in from the Department of Agriculture. So we tried to get as many stakeholders as we could, and really to put shape on the research questions and what we need to know about forestry in Ireland. And this led to, these are the different projects. So we've 4 different PhD students. So in geography, they're looking at climate justice. So when the incentives, so if we roll back a few decades ago, the incentives were really just for timber supply. And if you were trying to grow wood quickly, Sitka spruce, it grows much faster here than in its native Alaska because our winters are much warmer. And Leitrim is one of the smallest counties of Ireland, but is also one of the most afforested. And there's been a huge push back there because these dense mono species were planted up very close to housing with very little consultation with local groups. And so there's been an anti-forestry group in Leitrim. So we want to avoid that. If we do want to afforest the country, we very much want to do it with the buy-in and support of local communities. So that's geography are looking at that. And just to say, of our land, 70% of the land in Ireland is owned by farmers or private landowners. So the state can only do so much. If we did want to afforest land, 30% is, so 70% being owned by farmers and landowners. It's absolutely crucial that we have the buy-in, because the state can only achieve so much on its own. The second one is based in engineering, and that's looking at the blended solutions and looking at the impact of, as I mentioned already, of how can we combine both nature-based solutions and technological solutions, and how can we minimize the impact of technological solutions on further environmental degradation. The third one is situation in the business school. And that's with my PhD student, Jula, and she is looking at perspectives on value and financial incentives. So we're looking at, what incentives exist for forestry in Ireland, and I'm going to talk much more about that project in particular. And then within botany, there's another PhD student, and she's looking at the ecological value of new forests. So it's crucial that when we're looking at financial incentives, we look at how do they work, but also what's the ecological benefit of different types of forests. So we are, in particular, our project, we work very closely with botany on this. Okay, so the first question I suppose that I thought of looking at is our current financial incentives. It's really clear that they're not working because we have had these financial schemes for decades, and if anything, the afforestation rates are decreasing. And what's incentivized at the moment is that farmers can apply and they receive a payment for 15 years, and that has just been changed to 20 years in the new forestry program, which runs from 2023 to 2027. So you receive a grant, an initial grant for putting up deer fencing, because we have a huge deer issue in Ireland, many parts of Ireland, funding to plant the trees, and then you get an annual subsidy for 15 or 20 years. But after 20 years, you get nothing. So a Sitka spruce forest will mature. You can start selling wood after about 30 years. So if you plant monospecies that can be harvested for timber, there is a financial reward in the future. You can start thinning the wood or harvesting the wood, and you will get a financial return from that. But if you're a farmer who wants to plant say mixed native species, and you don't want to plant them in a way, so the monospecies are planted, there's roads in them, they're planted in straight lines, they're easy to harvest, and our sawmills are built for receiving just one kind of wood, which is the Sitka spruce. But if you planted mixed native woodlands, it's first of all pretty more difficult to harvest them, but you also might like to plant an oak, majority oak woodland, and not harvest it, but plant it for other reasons. And that's not been financially rewarded. So at the minute, if you're a farmer and you've got a field and you want to put in a mixed native woodland, yes, you'll get payments for 20 years, but after that, that land becomes worthless. And so farmers think ahead. They think ahead about future generations. So you would only do it if you had you will be paid in the short term, but the fact that your land becomes worthless in the future, to me, is a major barrier to planting. And there's other issues with licensing. There's a 2-year wait on trying to get a license to plant a woodland, and that's an issue as well. So, as I said, therefore, rationally, if you were financially motivated by that empty field that you had, it would make most sense still to plant Sitka spruce, and then you'd, at least after 30 years plus, you'd have a financial return from harvesting that wood. And so my argument is, why are we not incentivizing forests for all of their ecosystem services? Because they sequester or capture carbon. They have, as I mentioned, a positive impact on water, soil, and air. The only marketable value is timber, the only one that you can receive a value for by selling it. Value at amenities, I suppose you could charge the public to come in. I suppose that's potentially marketable. And then biodiversity, there's no payment for that at the minute. So I call this, like, I don't know if anybody knows the game from when you're a kid, but top trumps. My boy cousins used to have it, where you have different, I think it was done for high-speed jets, and some of them were faster and some of them were bigger and some of them were more powerful, whatever it is. And this, I think, is like a top trumps of forestry, because if you were looking at forestry for carbon sequestration, Sitka spruce will do a better job than planting oak, because oak it grows much more slowly, and it takes about 80 to 100 years to mature. So faster growing woods will sequester carbon more quickly. However, if you are looking at biodiversity and habitat for native plant and animal species, you'd be better to plant a mixed forest of native trees. Again, the impacts on water and soil will depend on species and amenity. Generally, people prefer mixed native woodlands to Sitka spruce for amenity value. So different types of woodlands have different types of values here. So it's not as straightforward to say Sitka's worse, native is better. They have different ecosystem services, and they depend on what tree species you're talking about, the land that it's planted, or the soil that it's planted on. I've mentioned Sitka being planted on peat wasn't a great idea, which hopefully won't be repeated. And the third one is the stage that it's at. So, Sitka, when it's growing very rapidly at a younger age, would sequester a different amount of carbon than when it's mature at 30 or 40 years. So it and also for biodiversity, again, when it's quite light initially, it can support biodiversity, but when it can become very dark with very little light coming in, so you'll find very little plants or understory in the forest with a mature monospecies Sitka wood. So it depends on different things. So that's why I called it this top trumps, where you have to take different values of these ecosystem services for different types of woodlands. So the research questions, I suppose, under our particular piece of this research, Julia, my PhD student, is looking at, the first thing we thought we should look at is, well, sorry, I meant to mention one thing. So in terms of coming to the true value or total value of forests, timber is easy to value because we have a marketable value. Value as amenity, you can ask the public how much they're willing to pay into a forest. You can get to a value of that. Carbon capture, there's models for tons of carbon captured. We have a price on carbon through the carbon tax or the cap and trade system in Europe. Impact on water and soil and air quality can be measurable to some extent. Certainly with water, Irish Water is now they're planting trees alongside rivers rather than using chemicals. And they can very much, the nature-based solution, if the trees is doing the filtration of the water rather than the chemicals, you can price that value by looking at the cost of the chemicals. But the big thing that's missing here in terms of how do you value it is biodiversity. So when we tried to create this forest scorecard and trying to plug values into this, where we came up empty-handed, is how do you value or how do you put a price on the value of a home for biodiversity in the form of forestry. So while we want to get to this eventually, this is the part that we're starting on in our research, because this is the missing piece at the minute. So in order to try and value forest biodiversity in Ireland, we start by looking at internationally, how has forest biodiversity been valued in other contexts? What methods have been used to put a value on biodiversity, and specifically what have they been valuing? The next part is then, well, how do we do that in Ireland once we know what's happening overseas? And thirdly, how do we use that information? So how do we plug that back into that scorecard, and how do we use that scorecard to create a true value of forestry, and what do we use that for? So the first one is looking overseas. So Julia's done a systematic literature review, and she's looking globally at studies on forest biodiversity, which are putting a value on the biodiversity supported by forestry, and it's done by hectare, by year. It can be done by individuals. So there's a lot of different methods, and what she's doing is a meta-analysis where she's trying to use all of the inputs, all of those different values from, I think it's 75 different values she has in total, and trying to come up with I suppose, a consensus from those studies on what the value of biodiversity should be per hectare per year. And she's using different things like GDP per capita. So how rich is the country? You'd expect that there may be more value put on biodiversity in richer countries, but also the existing forestry. So what she's also finding is in countries that have very rich ecological systems in woodlands, they tend to value it more. I mentioned before there's little forest culture in Ireland. So I've even had people say to me, well, why do we need more trees? So that kind of getting a lot of people don't really appreciate, I think, the value of forestry. So again, we'd expect in countries with rich ecological zones that if you ask the public, that they will put a higher value on biodiversity. So that's underway at the moment. Findings are almost complete. The second thing that we're going to do, so that's in the international context. And then when we talk about the Irish context, we're doing two things. So the first is that we are asking forest ecologists to rank different forests. So as I said, it's not that straightforward in terms of, as somebody said, Sitka spruce has been painted as a biodiversity black hole, but it's not necessarily that simple. So we've created a matrix, and we have three different forest types. We have Sitka, or monospecies non-native. We have predominantly oak, and we have predominantly birch, because they're the most commonly planted woodlands at the moment. And we're asking, and then we're putting different soil types and different life cycles. So whether it's in the early, medium or mature stage of forest, because that really matters again about biodiversity. And we're giving that matrix. We sent it out to forest ecologists, and we've just asked them to rank those forests. So if, for example, 0 is a car park, and 100, a square of 100 is an ancient oak forest that's been around for hundreds of years, how would they rank those different forest types in between? So is a mature Sitka spruce forest, you know, a 10, or is it a 20? Is a new oak forest, how rich is that? So it's desk based, and it's really their opinions. And we're using a Delphi method where we ask everybody once, and then we go back to them a second time, where we give them the average response from others, and they get a chance to reevaluate their responses. So we're trying to get to a consensus ranking of different forest types. But that'll just be a ranking. We won't have a financial value on it. So the second step, once we have the ranking, is to go to try and put monetary values on those rankings. And we're going to ask farmers or landowners for their willingness to accept. The WTA stands for willingness to accept. What would they need to be paid in order to afforest that field? So they have a forest at the minute, they have a spare field at the minute, or maybe there's cows or sheep or crops in it. But if they were to manage that, to put a mixed native forest, for example, what payment would they need to receive in order to do that per year and per hectare? And that, of course, will depend on alternative land uses and the subsidies that farmers currently receive for other agricultural means. And we'll then ask the public what's their willingness to pay. So if that's been to be done through public sector subsidies, we haven't figured it out yet, but we're thinking, you know, what tax would you, we don't know how, we haven't figured out how to phrase the question, but what does the public think of the tax that we pay? How much do you think should be paid to subsidize farmers to provide this public good? Because an awful lot of the values of forestry are public goods, they benefit everybody, and so farmers need to be incentivized to provide those public goods on their land. And finally, investors or corporates, so CSRD, the disclosure regulations on biodiversity are of course going to provide a stronger incentive for companies, we think, to invest in nature, or to be seen to be making an investment in nature, and investors again through SFRD and CSRD as well. So what's their willingness to pay? What would they be willing to pay a farmer? So we're looking at subsidies from the public sector to pay for biodiversity or woodlands in total, and we're looking for payments from the private sector, and that's to try and put a value on the biodiversity benefits of woodlands. And then just to briefly mention the other research that's been done in botany, because I said we're working very closely with them. They have the access to the forest ecologists to ask them the desk-based opinion, but also Kate Harrington, who's the botany PhD student, she's going out and doing site visits. So the native afforestation scheme, so where native woodlands have been planted, there's lots of sites across Ireland, and she's gone out to sites looking at them from very new plantations to ones which have been around for 20 years. And she's trying to see, well, how good are they for biodiversity? So how long does it take for, if you plant a field that was previously used for farming, for example, and then you put native trees on it, how long does it take for biodiversity to return? And how good are these new forests for providing habitat for biodiversity? So she has, this is just an overview of her research. She's looked at, last summer, she looked at 47 sites, sorry, last summer and the summer before. And she's finding that it really matters how long the woodland's been there. Between different native species, so different types of oak and alder, she's finding little difference in the biodiversity benefits. She's finding that hedgerow species are naturally regenerating themselves, and that the past land use, so whether it was just wasteland or whether it was used for agriculture, or we even have a golf course, it really matters, because obviously agriculture would have been using herbicides and pesticides. Golf courses are probably the worst in terms of the amount of herbicides and pesticides. And of course, the land is going to take longer to regenerate, to recover, depending on the previous land use. And she's done surveys of, initially she looked at flora, and then this summer gone by, she was looking at insects. So that's also an input into our values of biodiversity. So I suppose why, if we're getting this value of biodiversity and we're plugging it into what I'm calling the top trumps, why do we need, what's the impact, the potential impact that we want? If the objective is to come to a financial value of the total value of woodlands in Ireland, why does this matter? And what I would like to see is that government subsidies incentivize all types of forests. We do need timber supply, of course, but the fact that 80% of our woodlands are currently designed for timber supply, I think we need much more than 2% native cover and native trees. And as I said, a lot of this is it's a public good, and subsidies, governments historically, they do subsidize public goods. They subsidize the arts, education, health. So these benefits for biodiversity and for climate are a public good and need to be paid for. The second reason I think it's important is to subsidize or to put a price on private sector payments. I think that it's clear that we need to crowd in the private sector. We need industry, we need businesses to pay farmers for providing ecosystem services on their land. So what I would like to see is, and we have some small examples of it already, but that farmers can apply for government subsidies for biodiversity, but they can also receive money from the private sector. And the third reason why I think this is really important, and you do get pushback sometimes where people say, why are you trying to value nature? You can't put a price on nature. And I completely agree. And ideally we would have legal protection and enforcement that our current nature would be protected, or that forested sites would be protected. But at the minute, we don't have that. And so to me, finance is a way to make sure that nature is included in decision making. So currently in Ireland, if you were to build a block of flats and you had one site which is currently a car park, or it's cemented over, and you have a second alternative site which is a 200-year-old oak forest, the only difference in the cost for a builder is the cost of actually removing the trees. So I want that 200-year-old oak forest has a value, 10 million, 20 million, 100 million, who knows? But that needs to go into the balance sheet, because it needs to be recognised that if you do have to build the flats and remove those trees, you are removing ecosystem services which are a public good and do have a value. So I want to get it into the balance sheet so that the nature is taken into account in decision making. And then lastly, I probably have sped through that a little bit too much. Just in terms of, as I said, it's been a really interesting research project to date, and it was picked up a small piece in RTE. I'm just going to play the video because it's videoed in a lovely woodland that I don't own, but somebody else owns. And I think it just kind of wraps up nicely when we're talking about trees. But the other thing that this has led to is I was asked to appear at an Oireachtas committee, which is a cross-party government committee. And it's to try to get cross-party decisions or policy decisions, and it was on the financing of nature restoration. So we of course have had the nature restoration law progress in Europe. In our last budget, we had an announcement of a 3 billion fund to finance nature restoration. And I was asked to talk about methods. So there was a lot of ecologists brought into this committee, but I was brought in specifically to talk about financing. So the three things I spoke about were that the government subsidies for agriculture be changed so that a farmer can get as much from biodiversity on their land as they can from agriculture, which unfortunately agriculture in Ireland is one of the most polluting industries that we have. Our beef and dairy farming, of which 90% is exporting, is also polluting our rivers, unfortunately. So we are subsidising pollution at the minute, and we're not subsidising ecosystem services. So there's some small policies in place, but they need to be much more ambitious. My second recommendation was a citizens' green bond, which is already in the UK, to give citizens a sense of agency. We have post office savings bonds, but why not use them to fund green projects? And it gives people a sense of buy-in. You know, you have often with the National Lottery funding something, why not have electric buses in Dublin with plastered across it that this is funded by a citizens' green bond? And my third recommendation was that we have a regulated biodiversity credit market, and that's really to crowd in private sector funding that businesses can buy credits, and they know that they're used to incentivize farmers to provide habitats for biodiversity and to protect that. So I'll play the video next. So let me just make sure I do this right so that people can see this. So I'll just make this large. Sarah, you might tell me if you can see and hear this okay. I'll play and then pause it.
Yeah.
All good?
Yeah.
Okay, it's nice and short. It's only 3 minutes, so I'll stop talking after that.
What we're trying to do is a kind of scorecard of the different benefits for different woodlands at different points in time, planted on different soils.
Siobhan Maloney and Martha O'Hagan share a passion for Ireland's native forests. Siobhan actually owns one here in Aughrim, County Wicklow.
The history goes back beyond any living memory of this forest. I've certainly found evidence of it on maps from the late 1700s.
But forests like this are few and far between in Ireland.
Many people don't know how deforested Ireland is. The average in Europe for forest cover is around 35%. In Ireland, we are at 11%, and we've only 2% of native woodlands.
Fast-growing non-native conifers like the Sitka spruce make up most of the national forest cover. Under the government's new forestry programme, farmers can benefit from increased grants and the extension of annual premium payments for a broad range of planting options. But Martha believes the incentives still favour growing trees for timber more than anything else.
If you want to plant a forest like this, if you want to keep a wood and not cut down trees for timber, if you want to keep it closed canopy for hundreds of years, you get paid for 20 years, and after that you receive nothing.
Martha is working on a project to develop a measure of true value for Irish woodlands. It's a kind of scorecard which marks the different types of ecosystem services they provide.
My simplest way to think about it is like the game Top Trumps. So we have different species of trees at different points in their life cycle on different soils. So they're the different categories. And then we're scoring them by those 5 different attributes. In creating that scorecard, what we ultimately want to do is to assign a financial value to each of those attributes for the different types of woodlands.
Martha hopes her project can lead to better designed subsidies. The project appeals to people like Siobhan, for whom forestry is about much more than quick wins and profit.
Mine is a 150-year plan. I think initiatives like Martha will encourage that alternative viewpoint, a different perspective, looking at values of lands according to different criteria.
Woodlands, apart from being beautiful and magical and inspiring, have many, many other benefits. I suppose we've mainly looked at woodlands either through parks for amenity value or the Sitka spruce plantations for timber. But what about the carbon sequestration, the water filtration, etc.? There's a public benefit of the ecosystem services that a forest produces. Why aren't landowners being incentivised? Why aren't they paid for as long as those ecosystem services accrue?
And that's it, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Martha. Absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that presentation, and especially the video at the end as well. So now I'm going to open this up to a Q&A. Before I do so, I will stop the recording. I find from experience that people can speak a bit more freer when they don't feel like they're being recorded. So I'll stop the recording now.